Away from 9 o'clock here on the South African morning. Such a big discussion this. The last US evacuation flight has left Kabul, but thousands still want to get out of Afghanistan. They've simply run out of time. They've run out of flights. In the past few days, though, twin blasts reported prompting several countries to stop their evacuation plans. So that hasn't helped at all. Greg Mills from the Brenthurst Foundation joining us. Hello, Greg. Always a huge pleasure to have someone with your knowledge to speak to us about this, because it is so complex in Afghanistan, isn't it? But what is not complex is there was a deadline put in place by Joe Biden. That deadline has now arrived, and yet there's still too many people who didn't get a flight out, not to even talk about those who lost their lives trying to do that. So what happens now to those who are left behind?
Morning. It wasn't a deadline put in place by Joe Biden. It was the terms of the agreement with the Taliban. So it was a mutual agreement. I think the Americans probably would have liked to have extended it. Certainly their NATO allies would have liked to have extended it, but were unable to convince America to be able to convince the Taliban. What happens to the people left behind? Well, it depends where you draw the line. I mean, there's roughly 40 million Afghans. Probably 35 million of them want to go and live in the United States, ironically, if one had to do a poll. So you're probably only going to get in those who are immediately vulnerable or at risk. And many of those have been moved over the last 10 days in an extraordinary effort. One of the most badly planned and conceived withdrawals or evacuations probably in history. I mean, it makes the Saigon exit look relatively orderly, but ultimately managed to get out over 125,000 people at risk because of the acts of people on the ground. And certainly personally, I was drawn into it, having spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, from Afghan friends, again, risk, and we managed to find a way, once we'd worked out what the system was, to be able to get those people out into safety. So there were many people like me and my colleagues working very hard to move people at risk. It really remains to be seen what happens now. Now the Taliban have taken it, they own it, and they have to run it.
Greg, I'm so glad you mentioned that you were in Afghanistan as well, because I was going to ask you that in my follow-up question about this. As someone who's been there, knows the intricacies of being a foreigner in the country, A, but then B, also being a citizen in Afghanistan. If somebody is still there, and you mentioned that there are so many people who still want to leave, was that last flight out of Kabul essentially the last flight of hope, or do you foresee a situation where either negotiations can open up again, or at least a discussion can be had about getting other countries in to get out their citizens and those who want to leave, or is this the end of the road, essentially?
Well, I mean, there's always a danger. I mean, there's two processes here. It's one, the Taliban letting them go, and the other, those countries receiving them, willing to have them. So, and then there's, of course, the mechanics and logistics in between. So it depends to an extent on what sort of government the Taliban want. If they want the degree of legitimacy that they probably crave, because that means money and humanitarian support and international respectability, they're going to have to play along with certain international norms on human rights and on allowing such people to leave. If they don't, and if they resemble the Taliban of between 1996 and 2001, when they were removed by the US invasion, then it's likely that they won't get that legitimacy, they won't have that authority outside of Afghanistan, and in fact things will deteriorate considerably in the country. Of course, there's a danger too that the outside world now switches off to the concerns of Afghanistan and of Afghans, and even before the collapse of the government, there were already roughly 18 million Afghans deemed to be at some degree of humanitarian risk. And that's only going to increase as essentially the country has although it's now unified in a sense under the Taliban, it's also largely cut off from each other, and the economy is very badly broken. So a lot of responsibility is going to sit on the region in particular, because in a sense they've contributed to this overturning of government, particularly Pakistan, and now they too are going to own it. Whether they're the dog that catches the car tire and finds it very uncomfortable and very difficult is to be seen.
Greg, in the last minute that I have with you, I would like to have had a chance to discuss about further conflicts, but now that the Americans have pulled out, are we still going to see these Taliban attacks? But that could be a discussion for another day. What I think is a big concern, especially at the end of Women's Month and the rights of women in Afghanistan itself. We were seeing when they took over this new government that they seem to be very pro-women's rights. Do you think that was a facade, or do you think that could be a change of things to come? Last minute or so is yours.
Well, because they were so against essentially what we see as liberal women's rights in the Western aligned world, they're now trying to put on a different face. But, you know, deeds are greater than words. This is a very conservative theocracy. It's established an emirate. There's a debate about whether women should be allowed to work, and they say yes, they are, but some people say no, they're not, whether they should wear a burqa or whatever. These are questions which are immediately being posed at the Taliban. There are a couple of very briefly silver linings in this process. One, the country, its infrastructure and its government structures are largely intact given the rapid nature of the collapse of the government. And secondly, there's a lot of stuff that's changed between now and 2001. For one, cell phones have changed the country. There's 30 million Afghans that are connected with each other. Will the Taliban allow that to continue? I think they'll find it very turning it off. And finally, of course, there were just 1 million people in school in 2001. There are 10 million people in school. Half of them are women today. They're going to find that very difficult to put back in the box too. So there is some hope, but a lot depends on what the Taliban wants to be.
Well, without hope, we don't have much at all, as we are going to keep a close eye on Afghanistan. For the moment, thank you. It's always such a pleasure to have you with us. Greg Mills from the Brenthurst Foundation, speaking firsthand of what it looks like in Afghanistan over these years and hopefully what it's going to be going forward. My thanks to you, Greg. Always a pleasure.